welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about another character from American Horror Story Freak Show. This one we are talking about is Jimmy Darling, who played Lobster Boy in the sideshow. He was born with a condition known as ectrodactyly, and we're going to discuss the real life person that he was based on, although they are very, very different from the show versus real life. But first we're going to talk about what ectrodactyly is, so let's get right into it. So ectrodactyly is a deformation, malformation, where the fingers and sometimes toes are split down the middle, and there's a cleft between the fingers all the way through the hand, and then the hand tends to look more like a lobster claw versus a normal hand, which is where the Lobster Boy sideshow came from. It's also known as split hand-foot malformation. SHFM is sometimes referred to. It can be hereditary, or it can just happen just out of nowhere. Just a gene mutates during the developing stages, and it just happens randomly, or it can be hereditary. So in the case of Jimmy Darling in the show, his was clearly just a genetic mutation because neither of his parents have this malformation. But in the real life case, it's a lot different. We'll get into that later. In the case of the hereditary malformation, sometimes they're a dominant gene and sometimes they're a recessive gene. It just depends on the situation. Sometimes all four limbs can be affected, and sometimes it's just hands or just feet. If there is just one singular limb that is affected, that's usually just a mutation, not necessarily genetic. But if more than one limb is affected, usually that's hereditary, but not always. This condition affects men and women equally, and there's about 1 in 18,000 in the general population, although in the real life case, it runs in that person's entire family and his children have it, so they are obviously more prone to have it than the general population, and they kind of raise the distribution a little bit. So if the malformation is extremely severe, they may see it during like a birthing ultrasound, like a routine ultrasound, maybe not. Sometimes, you know, the baby doesn't really cooperate and they don't like to show themselves to the camera, you know, so can be found, maybe not. Obviously it will be diagnosed when the child is born. They'll do x-rays just to confirm how severe it is and if they can do any kind of reconstructive surgery to try to treat it, although that is really the only treatment there is other than like a prosthetic. If it's very severe, there's obviously no just a magical cure for this disease, unfortunately. The character played on American Horror Story was similar to the real life person in a few aspects, but not all of them. So the character in the show just has the two hands that are deformed, and he has normal feet. He's able to walk. In the show, he is a heavy drinker, and no one else in his family has this malformation, so he feels a little isolated. He can be a little violent. He did kill someone in the show, which is oddly similar to the person whom he's based on, but in most ways, he's not very similar to the character to the real life person that he was based on. So let's discuss that person. His name was Grady Stiles Jr, and he was known as the real life Lobster Boy, and he has generations upon generations before him that have the same malformation, and his children also have this malformation. So once his two children who had the deformity were old enough, they joined him in the show, and that was that became the Lobster family. His third child, Donna, does not have this malformation. We'll talk about her again a little bit later. So he was born in 1937 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. As I said earlier, this malformation has ran in his family since around the 1840s. So as you can imagine, people probably treated him a certain type of way. Also, I mentioned in the first video I talked about the freak show. He got rude comments and stares and looks, and he wasn't treated very well by the general population, and I think he maybe really harbored that resentment and used alcohol to cope. So he was a very, very violent person towards his family, especially. Everyone lived together in the compound while they were performing, and they'd move around all together, so all the performers knew what he was like when the show lights were off. And he was very well known for violently hitting his wife Mary and their children and being all out belligerent, despite the fact that he could not even walk because he had the deformity in all 4 limbs. So his legs were like turned in to the point where he couldn't bear weight on them, so he got around by a wheelchair, and he used his arms a lot to get around, so he had a very strong upper body, which was an advantage to him as far as attacking other people, because as soon as someone would make him angry, he would just bolt out of his chair and scurry across the floor and attack them and get them on the ground and brutally assault them. And his wife was not an exception to that. At one point, he assaulted her and violently removed her IUD that she used to prevent pregnancy. She did leave him at this point, but not for good. We'll come back to that later. So even though Grady was very much tortured by how the public treated him, he was one of the most popular shows in the carnival, and he made about $50,000 or so per season. And in the off season, they just lived in Florida, somewhere in Florida. So even though the people, you know, were very mean to him and gave him dirty looks and odd comments and rude whatever, he really made a lot of money off of them, especially during that time in the 70s. So 1978 is where it takes a very horrific turn for him and his family. His daughter Donna, who did not have the malformation, met a man named Jack, and they were just desperately in love, and Donna really wanted to get away from the family life that she had, so they were getting married. And at this point, Donna was about 17. Some sources say she was 15, some sources say she was 17. Jack at the time was 18, so it's not like it was that long ago. Like, I don't know how we don't know how old she was. How old is she now? Like, whatever. So this really, really, really angered Grady, and he did not approve of their relationship, and he was not going to allow her to be married, because at the time, which is still true today, you have to sign off if your minor wants to get married. The parent has to say it's okay. And he was not going to do that, because then he would no longer be able to control her. I don't know. So there's some conflicting evidence as far as what actually happened on this particular night. Some say that the night before the wedding, Jack went over to the family home and was going to tell Grady how it was, and other stories say that Grady invited Jack over the night before the wedding to discuss things or whatever, and maybe Jack thought that he was finally going to get his approval to be wed. I don't know. Either way, Jack walks in the house and gets a shotgun bullet right into the chest. Unfortunately, he did die at the Allegheny Hospital shortly after, and Grady did not try to hide the fact that he shot him, and he was proud of it. And his poor daughter sobbed and was heartbroken over the loss of her almost husband, her fiance, that her dad had murdered. And he didn't care. He said, "I told you I was gonna kill him. I said I would, and I did." And he was not merciful or sad about what he did at all. So at this point, Grady had another long list of severe medical conditions because of his lifestyle choices. Besides the fact that he was wheelchair bound, he also had emphysema, probably from smoking, cirrhosis from his excessive alcoholism, also had some kidney disease. So he did require a lot of care. This ultimately led him to be put on probation for murder instead of being put in jail. Yes, who knew it would pay to be so sick and unhealthy? So besides the fact that he was handicapped and the jail was handicap accessible, they weren't necessarily equipped to take care of all his other medical conditions. So he was put on probation for 15 years for murder. Okay. So unfortunately, this is not the last murder that would go on in his life, although in this second murder, he is the victim versus the perpetrator. So Mary, his first wife, eventually comes back to him at some point. Why? I don't know. I don't know why Mary did that. In some articles, she's referred to as Teresa. Her name was Mary Teresa, so I'm going to refer to her as Mary for the whole thing. But if you read an article and her name is Teresa, they're the same person. So after she had left Grady the first time, she did remarry someone else in the carnival scene, and they had a son named Harry. So after she divorced that person, got back with Grady, we're not going to discuss her choices, but that was a poor choice. 1992 rolls around and Mary is just done. Grady is treating her exactly the same as he was before, very violent, very aggressive, very drunk, and she just had enough. So she goes to her son and says, I have $1,500, find a hitman to take out Grady. And Harry says, you got it, mother. And he finds a person who also works in the sideshow business. His name was Christopher Wyatt. And he was 17 at the time, and he said, sure, I'll do it. Grabbed a gun and went on over there and shot him twice in the back of the head. Obviously, they were caught because I'm talking about it now. So Harry ended up being charged with life in prison for being the mastermind behind it, although, I mean, really, though, it was his mom, you could argue. But Mary got some leniency in the court because of all the abuse that she suffered. So she was sentenced to 43 years in prison, and she served most of it. She was released in 2000. I guess it's not most of it at all. She was released in 2000. The shooter, Christopher, was sentenced to 27 years. He was released in 2009, which was not 27 years total. And unfortunately, her son Harry did die in prison in 2014. So the funeral for Grady was a sad one, and not because people were mourning, but because hardly a single soul was even there. About 10 people showed up to his funeral. No one was willing to carry the casket, as is customary in American funeral ritual. He was pretty much hated by the community and the business for which he worked. A lot of the sideshow performers knew about him and didn't like him, the way he treated his family, the way he acted, the way he was towards everyone. So that was reflected in his funeral attendance. So that is the very strange story of Grady Stiles. His two children that still have the condition were on a freak show TV show on, I think it was on AMC, discussing their condition. I don't know that they have any children that have had the condition passed down to them. I don't think Donna ever spoke to her dad again after he killed her fiance. He is buried in Florida, where he will remain for eternity. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this one was interesting. It was definitely a lot more graphic than my first one that I made, but I thought that it was interesting how the American Horror Story character reflected him to a very small degree. You know, in the show he kind of gets it together and is a better person, but in real life he did not ever achieve that goal. But I would like to continue on to this series, so if you like it, please let me know down below. I would love to hear your feedback on what you think. If you did like it, please start CPR on that like button and defibrillate my subscribe button with 200 joules. Oh, you're not CPR certified? Well, there's a link down below to the American Red Cross where you can become CPR certified and save a life. The faster CPR is started on a person who is suffering a cardiac event, the more likely they are to survive. So if you sign up for that link down below, you could be part of saving someone's life. That is not an affiliate link. It's just very important that people know how to do CPR. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see y'all in the next one.